Dateline, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. You could be forgiven for thinking, a city named after not just one, but two cigarette brands. And it gets significantly more confusing when you consider that Winston-Salem goes by the nickname Camel City. But this place goes much, much deeper than that. There is so much more going on here, and in Greensboro, right next door. North Carolina's Piedmont Triad is full of all kinds of surprises, and we're gonna get into all of it coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics always welcome, and this one was viewer-suggested in a roundabout way, and I'll talk a bit more about that later in the video. But the crux of it is, I had an engagement in Winston-Salem, and if you watch this channel, you know I can't visit a city without making a video about it. But I was a little skeptical that I'd find enough to talk about in Winston-Salem, so I decided to do 2 nights there, and then 2 nights in Durham, North Carolina, thinking that between the two cities, I could probably piece together enough for a single video. I don't know why I thought this though. I mean, one of the revelations of doing this channel is that every city has truly unique and interesting things that make it different from every other city. It's kind of an underlying axiom of everything I talk about. And I just want to emphasize that I had less than 48 hours in Winston-Salem and just a couple hours in Greensboro. And I didn't get to High Point, North Carolina at all. So this is by no means going to be an exhaustive review of every possible interesting thing in the Piedmont Triad. Honestly, I kind of speed ran it, but I was just amazed at how much I have to say about it, to the point where you're going to get a completely different video on Durham in a couple weeks. Today is primarily about Winston-Salem though, so let's start with downtown. One thing I want to say right off the bat, one of my earliest videos was about cities that have terrible walk scores, but also have neighborhoods with amazing walk scores. And the big lightning bolt that came out of that for me was that Charlotte, North Carolina is terrible citywide, but downtown and the central neighborhoods are amazing. And when I actually got a chance to visit Charlotte last year, the central neighborhoods completely lived up to the hype. And what I think I realized on this more recent trip is that, for whatever reason, this isn't a Charlotte issue as much as it is a North Carolina issue. Winston-Salem has a walk score of 22, but downtown is an 87, and I don't even know if 87 does it justice. And I think the disconnect here is that, yeah, these are Sunbelt cities with lots of highway-enabled sprawl, but these are also cities that were industrial powerhouses long before the advent of the automobile. So for Winston-Salem, the older parts of the city have narrow streets, 1 lane in each direction, that are really enjoyable to walk. So there's lots of cool old architecture here. This old Reynolds building that's been converted into a hotel and condos is an absolute Art Deco beauty. But there's demand for newer multifamily too, which is kind of a relief to see because sometimes I think I'm the crazy one for thinking the downtown of a city like this should be a great place to live. I mean, I might be crazy, but for completely unrelated reasons. They also opened a new public space right in the heart of downtown, Marshall Park, and the Callidium Children's Museum relocated right next door, so you can definitely feel there's some momentum happening in the central part of the city. I'm going to come back to a couple other downtown adjacent districts, but let's take a walk south across First Street, which was once the boundary between the then separate towns of Winston and Salem, and we have to cross the Route 421 freeway another block south. So this is what they call the Strollway, and this is the connection between downtown and the Old Salem Historic District over the freeway that runs on the south side of downtown, and done a pretty good job of visually making it feel like you're not over a freeway, but I mean, yeah, visually they did pretty well here, but there's only so much you can do with the noise you're subjected to when you're crossing a freeway. But soon enough, you're passing through some very cool old industrial fabric, repurposed and apparently thriving. And you've got a little node of what appears to be trail-oriented density, and then soon enough, you're getting into what's known as Old Salem. So we just talked about the value of having a downtown that far, far predates the automobile, and it's fair to call what we just looked at downtown Winston. Well, this is what you might call downtown Salem. You'll see lots of references to the Moravian church here, and you can Google what that is if you want, because it's well outside the scope of anything I ever talk about on this channel. There's the Salem Academy and College, which I'm not familiar with, but the campus is kind of sweet. They don't have DEI here because that would be woke, but they do have EDI. There's a super cool historic covered bridge right in the middle of the city, and some of the buildings here actually house interesting local shops and restaurants that seem to do good business. Some of them are little museums, some of them seem to be just for show. I'm not saying that's good or bad. It does feel like a place frozen in time, which I think is the intent.
You know, I'm always a little when I'm walking through any kind of quote-unquote historic district in the South, because I don't know, there's a lot of heritage, but that word always seems to be a euphemism for something much more unsavory. But you can't deny that there's just a lot of interesting history here and just needs to be grappled with.
So real talk, I'm not an 18th century Southern culture fetishist, so let's stroll on back downtown and then take a left and head for the West End. Because if there's one thing I actually do fetishize, it's minor league ballparks. This isn't really the cool part of the West End, we're gonna get to that. But another thing I kinda suspected about North Carolina and was confirmed on this trip is, it is just amazing for minor league baseball, and it's incredible to me that there isn't a major league club anywhere in the state. This is the home ballpark of the Dash, High A affiliate of the Chicago White Sox. Historically, the mascot has been the Twins because it's Winston and Salem, but White Sox and Twins don't really mix, so they became the Dash in 2009, supposed to be a play on the punctuation that's in the middle of the city's name, much to the consternation of English majors everywhere because that's actually a hyphen and not a dash. So for one game last year, they changed their name to the Winston-Salem hyphens. God, pedantry is just a scourge on civilization. Bit of an odd location. They cleared lots of space for surface parking. It's right next to the Route 421 freeway. And the city helpfully provides interpretive signage to let you know there wasn't always a freeway here, but at least you get convenient access to the stadium. To be fair, the damage predates the ballpark by a good margin, and like downtown, there's a lot of new dense housing going in the surrounding area. There's more West End as you keep going west, though. Like downtown, it's mostly narrow streets, so the intersections are nice and compact with a lot of beautiful old commercial storefront architecture, and just a lot more busy spots than I was expecting. Further west, as you get to Ronalda Road and West End Boulevard, just amazingly cool buildings and converted industrial spaces, including the area around the West End Millworks. This is really just a confession of my own ignorance, but I did not expect to see anywhere near this diversity of active, interesting, vibrant locations all over the central core of Winston-Salem. And I haven't even got to what I think are the most interesting parts yet. This is Industry Hill on the north side of downtown, which has a bit more of an arty, bohemian feel, and maybe more inclusive and welcoming than I would have thought. Again, I plead the ignorance of someone who grew up in the Pacific Northwest of this country. Lots of adaptive reuse of the old industrial architecture that is almost synonymous with a lot of North Carolina cities, especially as you move east of downtown, and I've got a lot more to share on that front, and we haven't even gotten to Greensboro yet. First though, customary reminder to click on stuff. The notification bell is pretty key if you want to get notified when there's new content up. Lots of ways to connect. I do read all the messages I get through Patreon, and that was actually the genesis of this whole North Carolina expedition. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but if you bring me to your city to do a keynote or Q&A or whatever, I'm definitely going to do a video about your city while I'm there. And I can't guarantee I won't ridicule your city mercilessly, but you should probably realize by now that's just not my style. I like cities too much. Let's head back south. When you reach the end of the strollway and you're done visiting all the weird little buildings in Old Salem, you reach Salem Creek and the greenway that runs along it. Another dumb preconception I had about this city is that no one is going to be biking. And yeah, I mean, it isn't Copenhagen, but there's good trail infrastructure here and it definitely gets used, even when the weather doesn't seem super cooperative.
Did I tell you guys that North Carolina in June is kind of humid? And when you're on a trail like this that's kind of segregated from the city grid, it's not that easy to find water anywhere.
Here's the real gem of Winston-Salem's off-street path system though. It's the Long Branch Trail. If you haven't figured it out by now, probably the best part about having this channel is just being able to drop down into a city that I've never been to, and then just discovering things. Like, nobody even mentioned the Long Branch Trail to me in advance, I just stumbled onto it while I was wandering, and it is just a beautifully designed alignment on a defunct rail corridor. I almost feel guilty including this in the video, like I'm getting tricked into making a Chamber of Commerce style promo for the city. I won't go as far as to say this is Highline-esque, but when I talk about undervalued or underappreciated cities, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. There's a lot of trail-oriented development here, and you'll see the fingerprints of Wake Forest University all over a lot of this, including Phase 2 of the Innovation Corridor, construction of which is underway. And when you look west from the trail towards downtown, well, that's IQ Phase 1. I was going to have a whole thing here where I talk about adaptive reuse and the slightly unsavory aspects of North Carolina's industrial past, but I'm just going to hold off on that for now. The thing that really struck me was, when I'm out filming in a city, I sometimes end up a little disappointed because I'm not capturing as much human activity as I'd like to see. And then I can't tell if it's because my timing was bad, or maybe there's just a lot less demand for cool urbanism than what I'd like to think there is. And I kind of suspected Winston-Salem, Walk Score 22, was gonna be that kind of place, and I couldn't have been more wrong. I should have known better, and it's just one more example of the unsated hunger people seem to have for these kinds of environments. Okay, one last thing about Winston-Salem. There's an airport, the Piedmont Triad airport, but it's closer to Greensboro and it has GSO as a code. So Winston-Salem, a bit overlooked. And I was going to take the train to Durham, and North Carolina's passenger train, the Piedmont, which I'll talk more about in the Durham video that's coming soon. Well, that train stops in Greensboro and High Point, the other two nodes of the Triad, but not in Winston-Salem. So I had to take a bus to Greensboro, and there is local transit service that'll get you there from the downtown transit center, but I was going on a Sunday, and the Sunday schedule was just not convenient. So I had to take America's premier canine branded intercity bus service, which was fine. And okay, as much as I feel like I haven't done justice to Winston-Salem by only having spent like 24 waking hours there, it's about to get a lot worse because I absolutely did a 2-hour speed run of Greensboro, where I had to go to catch the Piedmont. Greensboro is actually more populous than Winston-Salem, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like it. A lot of what I'm showing you here is on Elm Street, the primary downtown commercial corridor, including what might be the world's least comprehensible bike rack. Architecturally similar to Winston-Salem in a lot of ways, including the integration of old industrial stuff with legacy rail infrastructure. Although in Greensboro's case, a lot more of the rail is being actively used. Elm Street is pleasant. This is early on a Sunday, so there's not a ton going on, but you can tell especially South Elm gets pretty active in the evenings. There's an old Crest department store here. I love it. The other thing here is, once you get away from Elm Street, and insert obligatory nightmare on joke here, but downtown Greensboro has some of the unsightly, wide arterial stroads that Winston-Salem generally doesn't. It looks like the city might be in the middle of retrofitting at least one of them to a more human scale. But man, this city also has some wild parking garages. I mean, these are like major city airport size facilities. A lot of underutilized land close into downtown, but also more dense housing in close to the center of the city than I was expecting. And honestly, a pretty slick downtown ballpark. This one is for the Grasshoppers, high A affiliate of the Pirates, and like Winston-Salem, lots of historical markers, even for this guy. But the coolest thing here, and I didn't have time to go inside, was another preserved department store, the Greensboro Woolworths, which is now a civil rights museum and the very site where the lunch counter sit-ins happened. Greensboro is not really a first-tier US city in terms of overall national profile. It's not even a first-tier North Carolina city, but it is right at the forefront when it comes to key events in the history of civil rights in the US. And as I headed to the Amtrak station just a couple blocks off Elm Street, I just couldn't help thinking, if we can ever get back to operating a great rail service that connects Atlanta and the Deep South to New York and the Northeast Corridor more than like once a day, Greensboro is going to be right at the heart of it, and it can really make such a huge difference for the fortunes of the city. But for today, I'm going to have to settle for just connecting to Durham. To be continued. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks to the patrons, and one patron in particular, you know who you are, for getting me out to the Triad. I had more fun in 2 days than I had any right to. Keep the great topic suggestions and travel opportunities coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.